On August 21, 2026, U.S.-Canada trade talks collapsed. The U.S. moved forward with 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, and PM Mark Carney announced Canada will impose dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs starting September 8, 2026. We're going to look at the top U.S. imports from Canada and which ones are impacted by tariffs. But first, let's talk about the three different tariff mechanisms at play. Section 232, or National Security Tariffs, covers steel, aluminum, copper, and softwood lumber. Core articles of these resources carry a 50% tariff, derivative products carry 25%, and high U.S. content metal or high U.S. percentage metal can get reductions down to 10 to 15%. In 2025, there was an investigation launched under Section 232 covering the approximate vital mineral commodities essential to the U.S. economy and national security, minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. The investigation found that, although reliance on importing large quantities of these minerals posed national security risks, no tariffs were imposed. The Commerce Secretary found the U.S. too reliant on foreign sources of these minerals and directed trade reps to negotiate supply agreements instead of restricting imports, the opposite of steel, aluminum, lumber, since the U.S. doesn't have enough domestic production of these to protect. Section 338, the new 50% tariff that took effect on August 19, 2026, after talks collapsed, explicitly excludes energy products, potash, and critical minerals, along with anything already taxed under Section 232 to avoid double stacking. It instead hits approximately 554 other tariff lines: alcohol, dairy, machinery, electrical equipment, cement, furniture, paper, textiles, autos. Copper is the one critical mineral that is being tariffed. It's on the critical minerals list, but is being taxed like steel and aluminum under its own dedicated Section 232 tariff. The U.S. imports about 45% of the copper it consumes. Canada's role is concentrated at specific points in the supply chain. It supplies over 99% of U.S. copper ore concentrate imports, about 46% of copper scrap imports, and about 17% of refined copper imports. Core uses include electrical wiring, grid infrastructure, electronics, plumbing, and renewable energy buildouts. Canadian crude is completely exempt from tariffs. Canada supplied $85.39 billion of the United States' $140.26 billion in total crude oil imports in 2025. Canada accounted for a record 60.9% of total U.S. crude oil imports in 2025, the highest share any single country has ever held. Volume averaged 3.9 million barrels per day, down about 4% from 2024. Canadian crude represents somewhere in the neighborhood of 19 to 20% of everything the U.S. consumes in oil and refined products. Canadian crude is mostly heavy, sour oil from Alberta's oil sands. It's refined into gasoline, diesel, heating oil, asphalt, and petrochemical feedstocks. These next three are covered under Section 232 tariffs. Canadian softwood lumber exports to the U.S. totaled $5.1 billion in 2024. Canada supplies about 74% of the total value of all U.S. softwood lumber imports. Imports overall make up roughly 30% of total U.S. softwood lumber consumption, and nearly all of that import volume is Canadian, so Canada accounts for roughly a quarter to nearly a third of everything the U.S. builds with. Combined U.S. tariffs and duties on Canadian softwood lumber for anti-dumping, countervailing, and Section 232 duties have roughly tripled recently to around 45%. This lumber is typically used for framing in residential construction. Lumber and wood products make up 15 to 25% of the total cost to build and finish a home in the United States. This also impacts furniture manufacturers, home improvement retailers, and pulp and paper applications. Canada is the single largest source of U.S. steel imports, worth approximately $7.1 billion in 2024. Canada supplies about 23% of total U.S. steel imports. Imports overall satisfy roughly 13% of total U.S. steel consumption, which means Canada's share of everything the U.S. uses in steel, domestic plus imported, works out to roughly 3%. Section 232 tariffs on steel currently sit at 50%. U.S. automakers and Canada's auto supply chains are deeply integrated. Steel often crosses the border multiple times before becoming a finished vehicle. Infrastructure, construction, and machinery manufacturers and metal packaging are large users of steel in the U.S. Aluminum. Canada exports around $8 to $10 billion of aluminum a year, depending on the year and data source. This is another area where U.S. dependence on Canada is high. Canada supplies somewhere between 53% and 75% of total U.S. aluminum imports, depending on the year and source. Because the U.S. imports about 60% of the aluminum it consumes, more than 75% of Canada's own aluminum production is exported to the U.S. Canadian smelters run almost entirely on cheap hydroelectric power, making them among the lowest-cost, lowest-carbon aluminum producers outside China. Section 232 tariffs on aluminum are also at 50%. Application includes aerospace, aviation, siding, window frames, and brewing companies. The next 4 critical minerals are significant imports but do not have any tariffs under Section 232. The U.S. imports about 93% of the potash it consumes, and 85 to 88% of those imports come from Canada. So Canada supplies somewhere around 75 to 80% plus of all the potash used in the U.S. Over 80% of the potash used in U.S. agriculture specifically comes from Saskatchewan. Potash is used in fertilizer, a core nutrient, potassium, for corn, soybeans, wheat, and cotton. Uranium. About a third, roughly 27 to 33%, of the uranium purchased by U.S. nuclear reactors in 2024 came from Canada, more than any other country. The U.S. imports nearly all the uranium it uses. Uranium is used for nuclear fuel, enriched into fuel rods for the approximately 94 commercial reactors that generate about 20% of all U.S. electricity. The U.S. imports about 48% of the nickel it consumes, and Canada supplies about 46% of primary nickel imports, putting Canada's share of total U.S. nickel supply at roughly 20 to 25%. Nickel is used in stainless steel production, high-temperature superalloys for jet engines and turbines, and defense-grade armor alloys. The U.S. imports about 73% of the zinc it consumes, and Canada supplies roughly 58 to 59% of refined zinc imports, putting Canada's share of total U.S. zinc supply at roughly 40 to 45%. Zinc is used to galvanize steel for corrosion protection, the largest single use, also batteries and brass and auto parts. The U.S. made the decision to take out oil and critical minerals from the tariff scope with Canada due to the need, and these resources make up a huge amount of the trade deficit we have with Canada today. Do you think these resources will be tariffed in the future? What are your thoughts on tariffs today? Comment below.